In November of 1983, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not because of a rogue missile, not because a dictator pushed a button, but because of a war game, a simulation so convincing, so frighteningly realistic, that the Soviet Union's most senior military commanders genuinely believed the United States was about to launch a first strike against them. And for 11 days, they had their fingers on the trigger. This is the story most people have never heard. The story the US government classified for decades. The story that, even today, makes former intelligence officers go quiet when you bring it up. This is the story of Able Archer 83. To understand how close we came, you have to understand the world of 1983. The Cold War wasn't just a political rivalry. It was a psychological siege that had been grinding on for nearly 4 decades. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear warheads to destroy human civilization several times over. Roughly 65,000 nuclear weapons existed in the world that year, and both sides had them pointed at each other. Ronald Reagan had been in office for 2 years, and he had made one thing very clear. He wasn't interested in playing nice with the Soviets. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile shield his critics called Star Wars. He deployed Pershing II ballistic missiles into Western Europe, missiles capable of reaching Moscow in less than 10 minutes. From the Kremlin's perspective, Reagan wasn't trying to win the Cold War diplomatically. He was preparing for a real one, and the Soviets were scared, not posturing, not bluffing, genuinely deeply afraid. In 1981, Soviet intelligence launched one of the most ambitious intelligence operations in its history. It was called Operation Ryan, a Russian acronym standing for Raketno-Yadernoi Napadeny, which translates roughly to nuclear missile attack. The KGB and the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, ordered their operatives around the world to monitor every possible indicator that the United States was preparing a surprise first strike. Not next year, not in a decade, right now, imminently. Soviet agents were instructed to watch for things like unusual activity at American military bases, spikes in blood bank donations near military facilities, emergency purchases of body bags, lights burning overnight in government buildings. To Western analysts, these might seem like paranoid fantasies, but to the Soviet leadership, men who had lived through the Nazi invasion of 1941, men who remembered what it felt like to be caught completely off guard, this kind of vigilance felt like simple survival. The pressure on KGB station chiefs was immense. Moscow Center wasn't asking them to report what they found. They were, in essence, being told what to find. And that distinction between intelligence gathering and intelligence confirmation would nearly cost the world everything. On September 1st, 1983, a Soviet interceptor jet shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, killing all 269 people aboard, including a sitting U.S. congressman. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. Relations between Washington and Moscow collapsed to their lowest point in years. Diplomatic back channels went cold. And inside the Kremlin, aging Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov, a man already dying of kidney failure, barely able to sit upright, conducting foreign policy from a hospital bed, became convinced that Reagan was looking for a pretext, an excuse to strike. The world was a tinderbox. What happened next was someone striking a match. On November 2, 1983, NATO began a routine annual military exercise. It was called Able Archer 83. On paper, it was exactly what it claimed to be: a command post exercise designed to simulate NATO's nuclear release procedures in the event of a Soviet conventional military attack. Staff officers in bunkers across Western Europe would practice the steps required to authorize and execute a nuclear strike, coordinating between different NATO commands, using real communication channels, sending real coded messages, following the actual protocols. What made Able Archer 83 different from previous year's drills wasn't one single thing. It was everything together. For the first time, the exercise involved a shift to a higher defense readiness condition, what Americans know as DEFCON. Real aircraft were moved, real troops were repositioned, and this time, unlike previous exercises, Able Archer 83 incorporated a realistic simulation of a transition from conventional warfare to nuclear warfare, the exact sequence the Soviets most feared. Adding to the alarm, this exercise involved realistic radio silence at key moments, a change in communication formats that Soviet intelligence had not seen before, and participation from heads of government including, according to some accounts, coded references to the involvement of President Reagan and other Western leaders, to a Soviet intelligence apparatus already primed to interpret everything as preparation for an attack. This looked exactly like the real thing. Soviet KGB and GRU analysts watching from the outside couldn't distinguish between Able Archer 83 and an actual prelude to nuclear war, and they reported accordingly. The Soviet Fourth Air Army in East Germany and Poland went to their highest alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft were prepared for immediate takeoff, armed and waiting. Warsaw-packed forces across Eastern Europe quietly moved to elevated readiness. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who was secretly working as a British double agent and would later become one of the most important intelligence sources the West ever had, reported back to MI6 that Soviet leadership was not acting. They were genuinely, viscerally terrified. He described a level of fear inside the KGB's Moscow center that he had never seen before and has never seen since. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. The United States didn't know any of this was happening. Not in real time. Not while it was unfolding. American intelligence had no idea that the Soviets had gone to alert status. No idea that nuclear aircraft were being armed on runways in Eastern Europe. No idea that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, men with the actual authority to launch nuclear weapons were watching Able Archer 83 and wondering if they needed to strike before the Americans did. Gordievsky's intelligence, shared through MI6 to the CIA, is what eventually opened American eyes, but not until after Able Archer 83 had ended on November 11th, when U.S. officials were finally briefed on what the Soviets had believed was happening, on how close Soviet forces had actually come to a launch posture. The reaction inside the Reagan administration was one of genuine shock. A recently declassified President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board report from 1990, kept secret for decades, concluded that Able Archer 83 may have been the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some historians now believe it may have been more dangerous. During Cuba in 1962, both Kennedy and Khrushchev knew they were in a crisis. They were both trying to find a way out. During Able Archer 83, the Americans didn't even know there was a crisis. They were playing a game while the other side was deciding whether to go to war. What stopped it? Discipline, caution, and possibly just luck. Soviet military commanders, despite their fear, despite the intelligence flooding in, decided to wait. They watched, they monitored. They held their position just long enough for Able Archer 83 to conclude and the threat, as it appeared to them, to recede. And something else happened too. Gordievsky's account and the subsequent intelligence reassessment it triggered reached Ronald Reagan, and it changed him. The president who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the men on the other side weren't just ideological adversaries. They were frightened human beings sitting in dark bunkers, watching the same shadows he was, and drawing their own terrifying conclusions. Reagan wrote in his diary that the intelligence about Soviet fears had really scared him. He began to soften his rhetoric. He pushed for direct dialogue. And in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow, Reagan was ready to meet him. The arms reduction talks that followed, the summits at Geneva and Reykjavik, The eventual end of the Cold War, all of it, at least in part, traces back to the shock of Able Archer 83. The exercise files remained classified for years. The full story only emerged in fragments, through Gordievsky's memoirs in the 1990s, through the gradual declassification of CIA and British intelligence documents in the 2000s and 2010s, and through that 1990 advisory board report that finally saw daylight in 2015. Even now, some of the operational details remain sealed. Some of the questions remain open. How close was a Soviet launch order? Who exactly gave what authorization? We still don't fully know. What we do know is this. For 11 days in November 1983, the world balanced on the edge of something it would not have survived. Not because of malice, not because anyone wanted war, but because of fear and misread signals, and the terrifying gap between what each side believed was true and what was actually happening. Two nuclear superpowers, armed to the teeth, running a drill, and one of them convinced it wasn't a drill at all. 11 days, a simulation, and the nearest we came, perhaps, to the last November any of us would ever see.